The sun hadn't even thought about peeking over the eastern ridge when a cold dread wrapped around old Silas' gut. He'd ridden this land free as the wind, since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His grandpappy had run cattle here, and his pappy before him. It was their legacy, etched in every dusty trail and every gnarled mesquite. But now, cutting across the range, straight as a bullet, stood a fence. A brand new, unforgiving fence, its barbed wire glinting like a serpent in the pre-dawn light, dividing what had always been be there. And as Silas rode closer, a knot of ice formed in his stomach. This wasn't just about cattle anymore. The silence of the early morning on the two rivers spread out like a vast, empty canvas, broken only by the rhythmic creak of Silas' saddle leather and the soft thud of his Mars hooves. For 50 years, he'd started his day this way, a ritual as ingrained as the calluses on his hands. He knew every dip and rise of this land, every hidden spring, every shadowed crevice. It was his blood, his breath. But today, something was wrong. A feeling like a cold draft whispering through a closed window pricked at the back of his neck. He was on his way to check the northern pasture, where old Bessie and her new calf had been grazing. As he topped the rise overlooking the long sloping stretch down to the Cottonwood Creek, his eyes, sharp even with age, narrowed to slits. There it was, a line dark and stark against the fading night, slicing through the familiar landscape. A fence. New posts, fresh wire, glinting with a malevolent sheen in the faint light. His heart, usually as steady as a rock, gave a lurch. What in tarnation? He muttered, the words catching in his throat. This wasn't just a new section of an existing boundary. This was an entirely new division, cutting right through the heart of the open range, land that had been free for generations. Land that belonged to no one, and thus to everyone who respected its wild spirit. A wave of disbelief, then a slow, simmering anger began to churn within him. He pushed his hat back, running a calloused hand over his grizzled jaw. This wasn't right. Not one bit. He spurred his Mare forward, the rhythmic thudding of her hooves echoing the pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he saw the fresh scars in the earth where the postas had been driven, the newness of the wood still raw. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He ran his gloved hand along the barbed wire, feeling the bite of the sharp points, a tangible symbol of the intrusion. It was deliberate, it was calculated, and it was a direct challenge. Just then, a figure emerged from the direction of the old line shack, a silhouette against the rising sun. It was Gus, his foreman, a man as steady and dependable as the sunrise itself. Gus, usually a man of few words, walked with a purposeful stride, his rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, his face grim. Silas knew without a word being spoken that Gus had seen it too. "Silas," Gus said, his voice low, a gravelly rumble. He stopped beside Silas, his gaze fixed on the fence. "Woke up to it myself, like it grew out of the ground overnight." Silas just nodded, his eyes still scanning the fence line as it snaked off into the distance. "Who'd be crazy enough, Gus? This ain't just some squatter. This is an act of war." Gus let out a heavy sigh, shifting his weight. "Don't know, boss, but it ain't natural. And it's a long damn fence." Silas knew it. He could feel the weight of this unexpected intrusion settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about livestock anymore. This was about principle, about legacy, about the very soul of the land. He looked at Gus, then back at the glinting wire. "We ain't gonna let this stand, Gus. Not a chance in hell. We ride the line. See where it goes. See who's behind this abomination." It was a decision born of instinct, of a lifetime spent defending what was right, but it carried the heavy burden of the unknown. The worst, he knew, was yet to come. The sun climbed higher, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and gold. but the warmth did little to thaw the cold knot of unease in Silas's gut. He and Gus rode along the fence line, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. The fence stretched on, an unrelenting scar across the landscape, seemingly without end. Every post, every glint of wire, felt like a personal affront. It was an insult to the memory of his grandfather, to the spirit of the open range. "It ain't just a pasture fence, Silas," Gus observed, his voice tight. "Look at these posts, deep set. And that wire, military grade, almost. Ain't for holding in cattle." Silas grunted in agreement. He'd been thinking the same thing. This wasn't the work of a disgruntled neighbor or a stray prospector. This was something bigger, more organized, and far more sinister. The fence itself was an enigma, but what it implied was a direct threat to everything he held dear. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of the unknown. They rode for hours, the land slowly shifting from the familiar grasslands near two rivers to a more rugged, broken terrain. The fence, however, never wavered, maintaining its unwavering path. They bypassed a small, isolated cabin they occasionally used for shelter during long cattle drives, its windows dark and lifeless. Silas felt a strange sense of displacement, as if the fence had not just divided the land, but had also shifted the very fabric of his world. As they rounded a rocky outcrop, they saw it, a plume of dust in the distance, heading their way. Not a lone rider, but a small group. Silas immediately reined in his mare, Gus doing the same. They dismounted, seeking what little cover the sparse brush offered, their hands instinctively going to their rifles. Silas's calm observation instinct kicked in, overriding the surge of adrenaline. Who were these men? And why were they here, along this new, uninvited boundary? 3 riders, cloaked in dust, approached. They were hard-faced men, their eyes hidden beneath the brims of their hats, but their posture exuded a sense of cold authority. The lead rider, a burly man with a thick, dark beard, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from Silas and Gus. His gaze swept over them, then settled on Silas with an unnerving intensity. "You're on private land," the man stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Turn back." Silas's jaw tightened. "This land's been free for 100 years, friend. Who put up this fence?" The man's eyes, finally visible, were cold and unyielding. "That's not your concern. This land belongs to the new owners. And this fence is here to stay." "New owners?" Gus scoffed, stepping forward slightly. "We ain't heard tell of any new owners around here." The burly man shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Consider this your notice. Any attempt to cross this fence will be met with appropriate force." His gaze lingered on Silas, a silent warning passing between them. Silas held his stare, a silent battle of wills playing out in the dust. The audacity of it, the sheer arrogance, burned within him. But he also saw the cold resolve in the man's eyes, the readiness for conflict. He knew instinctively that a direct confrontation now would be foolish, outnumbered and outgunned as they were. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement. "We'll remember that," Silas said, his voice low, carrying a deceptive calm. He turned to Gus, a flicker of understanding passing between them. As the 3 riders continued their patrol along the fence, disappearing into the dust, Silas felt a profound sense of loss, not just of land, but of control. He had always been master of his own destiny on this range. Now, a simple, unyielding fence had taken that from him. It had stripped away his sense of security, his understanding of the world. And the chilling implication of new owners echoed in his mind, a harbinger of troubles far greater than a mere boundary dispute. He'd lost control of the narrative, and the stage was set for a far more dangerous game. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the rugged terrain. Silas and Gus had made camp in a hidden gully, a place Silas had known since he was a boy, a sanctuary that now felt less secure than ever. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that had settled in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The confrontation with the mysterious riders had left a bitter taste in Silas's mouth, a gnawing feeling of helplessness he hadn't known in years. He stared into the dancing flames, the flickering light playing tricks with his memories. He thought of his grandfather, a man of quiet strength who had taught him to read the land, to respect its boundaries, both seen and unseen. He remembered one particular evening, sitting by a similar fire, the vast expanse of the open range stretching out around them. His grandfather had pointed to the stars, his voice soft. "Silas, boy, this land ain't ours to own. We just borrow it. But we gotta protect it from those who'd cage it, those who choke its spirit." A pang of guilt twisted in Silas's gut. Had he failed? Had he been too complacent, too trusting of the unspoken laws of the West? The memory, sharp and vivid, brought with it a familiar ache, a sadness he usually kept buried deep. It was the ache of a promise made, a legacy to uphold, now threatened by an unseen enemy. "You quiet, boss," Gus observed, breaking the silence. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. Silas sighed, a weary sound, just thinking about old times. This land, it was always free, always felt like a part of me. He paused, a different memory surfacing, one he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He saw a young woman, her hair the color of spun gold, her laughter like wind chimes. Clara. They had planned a life here, on this very ranch, a future intertwined with the land. But then the drought came, relentless and unforgiving, and with it, the financial struggles that had driven her away, seeking a life less harsh. He had offered to leave with her, to find work elsewhere, but she had known his heart belonged to the ranch. "This is your home, Silas," she'd said, her voice laced with tears. "Your destiny. I can't ask you to leave it." He had watched her go, a piece of his soul leaving with her. The image of the fence, cold and unyielding, now seemed to mirror the barrier that had sprung up between him and Clara all those years ago, a barrier of circumstances, of unspoken needs. The raw emotion of that past loss, long suppressed, began to surface, mingling with the frustration and anger of the present. He felt a deep-seated fear he hadn't acknowledged until now, the fear of losing this land, his last tangible link to a past that had defined him. "This ain't just about the ranch anymore, Gus," Silas said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This is about everything, everything we believe in." Gus stopped cleaning his rifle, his gaze meeting Silas's across the flickering firelight. He understood. The next morning, they rode north, leaving the familiar plains behind. The land grew harsher, more desolate, transforming into a rugged, arid desert where only the toughest plants survived. The fence, however, persisted, a relentless scar across this unforgiving landscape. They rode towards a distant, shimmering haze, the only landmark the imposing silhouette of the Black Mountains. It was a place Silas had avoided for years, a place where the memories of Clara were particularly strong, for it was near there that they had shared their last quiet moments. He knew where this fence was leading. It was leading him back to a past he'd tried to outrun, and to a confrontation that would demand more than just his strength. It would demand a choice between the pragmatic, the safe, and the fierce, unyielding demand of his heart to protect what was truly his, even if it meant risking everything. The dust of the past was rising, and it was about to collide with the present. The air grew heavy, thick with the dust of the desert and the unspoken tension that clung to Silas like a shroud. The Black Mountains loomed closer, dark and imposing sentinels guarding whatever lay beyond the persistent fence. Silas knew this terrain, every treacherous crevice and every hidden spring, but it felt alien now, twisted by the presence of the steel and wire. They followed the fence into a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side, casting long, deep shadows. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves. Then Silas heard it. A low hum, faint at first, growing steadily louder. It wasn't the wind. It was something mechanical, something powerful. As they rounded a final bend, the canyon opened into a vast, hidden basin. Silas reined in his horse so abruptly Gus almost ran into him. Before them, sprawling across the basin, was a sight that stole the breath from his lungs and sent a cold shiver down his spine. It wasn't the ranch. It wasn't a cattle operation. It was a sprawling, makeshift mining camp. Drills whirred, machinery groaned, and men swarmed like ants around massive piles of excavated earth. The fence, Silas realized, wasn't meant to keep cattle in. It was meant to keep everything out. And then he saw him. Standing near a large portable office trailer, a man in a crisp suit, observing the chaos with an almost regal air. He was a stranger to Silas, but his face, sharp and predatory, felt instantly familiar in its cold ambition. This was the new owner. This was the one who dared to desecrate his land. Silas dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate. Gus was right beside him, his hand already resting on his rifle. The hum of the machinery was deafening, a relentless roar that seemed to mock the silence of the wilderness. "This ain't right," Silas said, his voice barely audible above the din. "This land, it's sacred. They're tearing it apart." He started walking towards the man in the suit, his strides purposeful, each step a declaration of defiance. Gus followed, a silent, unwavering shadow. The men working in the camp stopped, one by one, their eyes tracking the two figures approaching from the canyon mouth. The hum of the machinery seemed to falter, then slowly, grudgingly, began to die down, replaced by an uneasy silence. The man in the suits, seeing them approach, gestured to a burly guard. The guard stepped forward, blocking Silas's path. "State your business," the guard growled, his hand on his sidearm. Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the man in the suit. "You! Who are you? What in God's name are you doing to this land?" The man in the suit, sleek and unruffled, finally acknowledged Silas with a dismissive wave of his hand. He stepped forward, a sneer playing on his lips. "I am Mr. Sterling, and I'm developing this land, Cowboy. Something you wouldn't understand." His voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with a condescending arrogance that grated on Silas's nerves. "Developing?" Silas scoffed, his voice raw with fury. "You're butchering it. This ain't your land, Sterling. It's open range. Always has been." Sterling laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The law says otherwise. I own the mineral rights. Every inch of this basin. And if you interfere, you'll find yourself in a world of trouble." His eyes, cold and calculating, flickered over Silas and Gus, taking in their weathered clothes and dusty appearance. "You're an old relic, Cowboy. Times change. Progress marches on." "Progress?" Gus interjected, his voice low and dangerous. "You call this progress? This is plain greed." Sterling's gaze hardened. "I have permits, approvals. Everything is legal. You have no claim here. I have a claim born of blood and sweat and generations living off this land." Silas roared, his carefully controlled calm shattering. He took another step forward, his hand instinctively going for his pistol. But before he could draw, Sterling snapped his fingers. Suddenly, a dozen more armed men emerged from behind the mining equipment, their rifles raised, trained directly on Silas and Gus. The cold metal glinted menacingly. The air crackled with tension, so thick you could almost taste it. Silas knew in that gut-wrenching moment that they were utterly outmatched. Everything seemed lost. The fight, the land, the legacy, it was all slipping through his fingers. Just as the world seemed to shrink to the cold barrel of a rifle, A sharp, piercing whistle cut through the tense silence. From the narrow canyon entrance behind them, a lone figure on horseback emerged, riding at a furious pace. It was a woman, her long hair streaming behind her, her face obscured by the setting sun. She rode with a reckless abandon that suggested either madness or desperation. And as she drew closer, Silas's heart nearly stopped. It couldn't be. But the way she sat her horse, the determined set of her shoulders, the wild grace of her movement. It was Clara, the one woman he thought he'd never see again, riding straight into the jaws of peril, changing everything in a single impossible moment. The sudden, impossible appearance of Clara had frozen the scene, a tableau of armed men, an arrogant magnate, and two bewildered cowboys. Sterling's men, momentarily startled, lowered their rifles fractionally, their eyes following Clara as she reined in her lathered horse just a few yards from Silas, dust swirling around her. Her face, etched with worry and exhaustion, was unmistakable even after all these years. Silas felt a jolt, as if struck by lightning, a mix of profound relief and an agonizing surge of the old pain. "Silas," she breathed, her voice hoarse, her eyes wide as she took in the grim scene. I saw the fence." Sterling, recovering his composure, sneered. Well, a reunion. How touching. But this is hardly the time or place for sentimentality, Cowboy. He gestured to his men. "Get them out of here, all three of them." Silas, however, wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on Clara, searching for answers, for understanding. "Clara, what are you doing here?" Her eyes, once so full of laughter, now held a haunted look. "I never truly left, Silas. Not in my heart. When I heard whispers of this abomination, and then saw the fence myself, I knew I had to come back. I recognized the pattern. This isn't Sterling's first development." Her words hung in the air, a new layer of mystery added to the already volatile situation. Sterling's face tightened at her implication. Gus, ever pragmatic, seized the momentary shift in Sterling's attention. "What pattern, ma'am?" Clara dismounted, her gaze unflinching as she met Sterling's cold stare. "He's a land pirate, Silas. He buys up old mineral rights, throws up a quick fence to establish ownership, then strips the land dry before anyone can react. He's done this in 3 other states, leaving nothing but dust and desolation behind." She turned back to Silas, her voice dropping, filled with urgency. "He's got permits, all right, but they're often acquired through questionable means, and he relies on locals being too slow or too scared to fight back." Silas felt a fresh surge of adrenaline, not of fear, but of purpose. Clara's revelation, her unexpected presence, had given him something invaluable, knowledge, and a renewed sense of hope. He looked at the vast mining operation, then back at Sterling's smug face. The fence, that symbol of division and theft, now took on a new, more sinister meaning. It wasn't just a boundary. It was the first step in a systematic plundering. Sterling, sensing the shift in the tide, his composure cracking, barked orders. "Enough of this. Get them out." As Sterling's men moved forward, rifles raised, Silas felt a familiar pain flare in his old leg, a phantom ache from a long-ago injury. He was tired, bone-weary, and the odds were stacked against him. He glanced at Gus, then at Clara, her brave eyes still fixed on him. Even with her here, the solitude of the cowboy's life pressed in on him. This was his fight, his land. But now he had allies, an unexpected one and a steadfast one. Suddenly, Clara made a bold move. She stepped directly in front of Sterling, her voice clear and strong. "Mr. Sterling, you won't get away with this. I have documentation, testimony from the other communities you've destroyed. The law may be slow, but it catches up to men like you." Sterling's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his face. Her words had struck a nerve. This was the opening, the last chance. But it came with a risk so high, it made Silas's heart pound. If they stayed, they'd be taken. If they fought, they'd be killed. Silas looked at Clara, then at Gus. He saw the resolute determination in Gus's eyes, and the brave, terrified love in Clara's. He knew what he had to do. The path to the ranch, where this whole ordeal had begun with that accursed fence, now seemed less like a retreat and more like a tactical repositioning. He had to lead them away now and come back with a plan. "We go," Silas said, his voice low and firm, his eyes fixed on Clara. But not for good. He turned to Gus. "Get the horses. We'll follow the creek bed. They won't be able to track us easy in the dark." As Sterling's men closed in, Silas took Clara's arm, a silent promise in his touch. He still felt the doubt, the weary burden of a long fight ahead. But he also felt a resurgence of that stubborn cowboy courage, rekindled by a ghost from his past and the stark truth of the present. They would ride into the night, but not in defeat. They would ride towards the desolation of the dawn, ready for the desperate, perhaps impossible, battle for the soul of the land. The pre-dawn light painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and gray as Silas, Gus, and Clara rode towards the Two Rivers Ranch. They had ridden hard through the night. The image of Sterling's sprawling mining camp burned into Silas's mind. Clara, exhausted but resolute, had shared what she knew: Sterling's network of shell corporations, his shady legal tactics, and the trail of environmental destruction he left behind. The fence, that first unsettling sign, was indeed just the beginning of his brutal agenda. As they topped the final ridge and saw the familiar outlines of the ranch house, a wave of profound weariness washed over Silas. His body ached, his spirit was bruised, but a fierce resolve, forged in the fires of defiance and fueled by Clara's return, pulsed within him. Nothing would ever be the same. The innocence of the open range, the simple rhythm of cowboy life, had been shattered. They spent the next few days preparing. Silas, with Clara's legal insights and Gus's unwavering loyalty, began to gather evidence. They rode the entire length of the fence, documenting every inch, taking photographs, and marking GPS coordinates. They contacted local ranchers, sharing Clara's warnings, stirring a collective anger against Sterling's encroachment. It was a slow, arduous process, a battle of wits and wills against a formidable, well-funded adversary. The confrontation came not with guns blazing, but in a dusty, crowded courtroom in the nearest county seat. Sterling, arrogant and confident, had arrived with a battery of lawyers. Silas, dressed in his best, worn suit, felt a surge of nervous energy. But he wasn't alone. Gus stood by him, a silent pillar of strength. And Clara, transformed from the anxious woman of the desert into a fierce advocate, presented their case with a calm, compelling force. She laid out Sterling's history, the falsified documents, the environmental violations, the disregard for local laws and traditions. The turning point came when an old, forgotten deed, unearthed by Clara in the county archives, proved that a critical section of the land Sterling claimed mineral rights to was actually a designated historical landmark, a sacred burial ground for a local indigenous tribe. This detail, carefully omitted from Sterling's fraudulent permits, was the legal hammer blow. The judge, a man with deep roots in the community, listened intently, his face grim. The verdict was not a complete victory, not in the way Silas had once dreamed. Sterling's mining operation was halted, its permits revoked. He was fined heavily and ordered to dismantle the fence and begin environmental remediation of the damaged land. But the land wouldn't be truly free again. The legal battles, the scars on the earth, the memory of the threat, they would forever remain. The fence was gone, but the knowledge of what it represented, the vulnerability of the land, would never fade. Back at the ranch, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, Silas stood by the corral. Gus was tending to the horses, the quiet comfort of his presence a balm. Clara walked up to him, a gentle smile on her face. Her return wasn't just for the fight, it was for him. The shared battle had rekindled a bond that time and distance had never truly severed. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a deeper appreciation for what they had lost and what they had found again. "It ain't over, Silas," Clara said softly, leaning against the fence rail. "There'll always be another fence, another Sterling. But we know how to fight them now, and we're not alone." Silas looked out at the vast, darkening landscape. The range was scarred, but it would heal, and he too was changed. The fight had stripped away his complacency, forcing him to confront not just an external threat, but the unspoken regrets and fears within himself. He was no longer just a cowboy riding a familiar range. He was a guardian, a defender of a legacy, and a partner in a new, quieter kind of war. He reached for Clara's hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. He squeezed gently, a silent promise. The setting sun cast their long shadows across the dust, two figures standing against the vastness, transformed by the trials they had faced. The old cowboy, a little wiser, a little wearier, but with a fire in his eyes that would never truly die. He had learned that sometimes the fences that shouldn't be there reveal the paths that must be taken. "No," Silas murmured, his gaze sweeping across the horizon, a faint knowing smile touching his lips. "It ain't over. It's just the beginning."